Welcome to Silvicast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Brad Hutnick.
And I'm Greg Edge.
And we're both silviculturists with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show. You know, I really think they did a nice job on closing out this timber sale.
IKR. Really careful work on those OSR and IR areas.
Right.
And I really appreciate the CWD they left for the DLs.
DLs?
The drumming logs.
Oh.
NGL, Brad, BMP-wise, they could have put a few more BBDs on this run.
BBDs?
Well, those are broad-based dips.
Oh.
Still, I think this road is well away from the RMZ, and I didn't see any other WRs on the SWDV.
Yeah, so if I got this right, Greg, you had an extra helping of alphabet soup for lunch?
What do you mean?
Well, you know, hanging out at abbreviation station. All right, I give.
Is that
what?
Conjunction Junction?
Yeah, there you go. What's with all the acronyms?
Oh, I don't know. Hey, you know, I'm just trying to be efficient with my conversation, I guess. You know, conserve words.
Well,
that's what I'm doing.
Okay, let's just hope it's not the alphabet soup fallacy, which where you basically, in order to confuse someone, you may use words that kind of mask your understanding of something. So let's just hope it's not that. Otherwise, we're going to...
IDK.
Yeah. Oh, boy. You know, we're just going to call this the Dunning-Krieger show from now on, and then people can make their own assumptions about what we do and how we do things.
What does a country band have to do with this?
Yeah. You know, we're just going to leave it right there, Greg. Hey, you know, you didn't get the memo that I'm supposed to be the crazy one in these things either, right?
Well,
so
I don't know about that.
I had a guest actually say, "Oh, you're the crazy one, right?" Which was,
oh, that's good.
It was one of those things. But
my plan is working perfectly.
Yeah. But talking about acronyms, today we're going to be talking about DFRBs, or Dynamic Forest Restoration Blocks. Now, these are units meant to help us better plan forest management on a landscaped level. So let's meet up with our guests, Jeff Larkin, professor in the Department of Biology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania and forest bird advisor for the American Bird Conservancy, and Dan Heggenstaller, North Central Regional Forester for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Jeff and Dan have pioneered this concept across thousands of acres of forest land in Pennsylvania. And Greg, don't embarrass me with even more of your verbal shorthand.
What E?
This season of Silvicast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the Silvicast world go round, so thank you. Jeff Larkin and Dan Heggenstaller, welcome to Silvicast. For our audience, tell us a little bit about where you work and what you do. Dan, why don't we start with you?
Sure, yeah. I'm a regional forester for the Pennsylvania Game Commission's North Central region. And in that role, essentially, I work with our forestry staff, our land management staff, and our biologists to manage all the forested habitat on our state game lands. That's the public land owned by the Game Commission in Pennsylvania. All the state game lands in the North Central region of Pennsylvania. So we do everything from, lots of commercial timber sales to prescribed burning and non-commercial habitat projects. So our aim in the forestry division in the Game Commission is just to improve wildlife habitat on state game lands for the whole range of wildlife species in Pennsylvania.
I know, Greg, we get a lot of material that comes from the east, and I'm always impressed. It seems like Pennsylvania is kind of an eastern version of Wisconsin in some ways, maybe a little more hilly, in that regard, but very similar in the kind of just the landscape.
Yeah, a lot of where I work is at that interface between kind of the oak and the northern hardwood ecosystems. That brings some challenges. A lot of stands kind of could go either way with what they're going to be. But it's also fun because you get to work in a lot of different forest types. And I think it is pretty similar to some of the lake states.
Cool.
And how about you, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm Jeff Larkin. I'm a faculty at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and I'm also the forest bird habitat advisor for the American Bird Conservancy. I guess in those two roles, I think I have a terrific position in that I'm able to work with partners, collaborators to do a lot of the conservation science that leads to recommendations that we target for use by individuals like Dan and the Game Commission and others. And then on the flip side, I'm able to work with them directly. As an advisor for the American Bird Conservancy, I'm able to work with them directly to apply those best management practices or what other guidelines we might have on the land. So it's really exciting for me to be able to do science and see it be implemented full circle.
Yeah, I love the idea that you're kind of at that nexus between implementation and then what the science tells us. So you get to actually see, does something work or not work, or kind of take something from theory and actually see it on the ground.
Yeah, it's been tremendous over the last 15 years. So actually going on 20 years since I've been here at IUP, starting with the conservation science. What is it about the ecology of the species that we work with that we can learn and then synthesize into applied information, right? The applied information is critical. We always say that, not too many species have been saved by glossy documents. It's when those glossy documents are put to use. And being able to think about how we implement the science that we do, working with folks like Dan and the Game Commission and others, and then seeing that implemented, and then going back on the opposite end and doing the monitoring, right? And assessing the outcome assessments, being able to see if what we thought was going to work actually works. And if not, how do we improve that, right? That process of adaptive management. Yeah, so I'm quite fortunate to be in that position.
So today we're going to talk about dynamic forest restoration blocks, or DFRBs. So both of you, what are dynamic forest restoration blocks?
Well, essentially, DFRBs are simply landscapes where we are kind of putting into practice the notion that age class diversity all across the landscape and structural diversity within stands that's the approach that's going to benefit a wide range of game and non-game species. In particular, in Pennsylvania, a bunch of species of greatest conservation need that we really care about. So things like ruffed grouse, golden-winged warbler. And so as forester working for a wildlife agency, I feel like over the last 10 or 15 years, we've kind of been inundated by all those glossy documents that Jeff mentioned. They all seem to be about birds. The bird people seem to make really nice BMP documents for us. And the kind of through line in most of them was that, we need to diversify our landscape, increase age class diversity. But at the same time, some of those species like wood thrush or cerulean warbler, the emphasis there was really on the other end of the spectrum on late successional forests or, increasing structural complexity in those stands. And so I think it's important to make sure, like, the DFRB concept isn't super revolutionary. Like, we already had comprehensive management plans for all of our game lands. We had goals and objectives. But what is really important about it is that, in our region where we have almost 390,000 acres of game lands, sometimes your work ends up being quite distributed out there across all those areas. And you might not be moving the needle on those landscape level habitat metrics in any one landscape if you're not kind of attentively working in the same place for a little while. So what DFRBs really do is just focus your resources, of course, personnel and funding, and also really your attention on a particular landscape that you've designated with the goals and objectives you have for it, and kind of throwing everything at it in order to get it moving closer to the habitat conditions that we need for some of these species, like like ruffed grouse or woodcock or others that need that high level of interspersion. And so, in most cases, we're looking to meet goals that we already have set for the game lands. It's just a way to really concentrate efforts.
Mm-hmm. Dan, you said, well, it's not really revolutionary, but it kind of is, because your management is informed by what's happening at the landscape around where you are. And I thought there was a really good line in, I think, some stuff that I read about your work in Pennsylvania. It described this work as sustainable forestry applied at ecologically meaningful scales.
Yeah.
Which I think is really important, because I don't think a lot of us get the chance to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The science is increasingly clear that forest management activities that strategically and responsibly, right? I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here. Attempt to diversify age class and structural complexity at biologically and ecologically meaningful scales is going to be essential if we're going to be recovering many of these wildlife species that have been exhibiting long-term population declines, whether they're game or non-game species. It was through, I would say, a collection of research projects, not just from my lab at IUP, but throughout the East, folks looking at kind of the hidden lives, if you would, the hidden parts of bird lives that we might not have really had a good grasp on previously, that brought us to this conclusion that it's not just that a wood thrush needs an old forest, right? That might be where their nest is, and that might be where they sing most conspicuously, and we always then became somewhat associated with wood thrush, they need mature big forests. But as researchers began to look at the secret lives of the post-fledging, like what do they do when they leave the nest? And golden wing warblers, Cam Fiss, a student in my lab, and then thinking about Doug Raybuck's work with cerulean warblers, we quickly learned that where these species build their nest is not at all what it looks like where they bring their fledglings. And, just because you successfully leave the nest does not mean that you're going to grow a population. You need those juveniles to survive and migrate to Central and South America and return the next year. And you have to remember that these things, they pop out of the nest at like 8 days old. They don't have tails. They barely have feathers. They're terrible flyers. Everything wants to eat them. They can't move very far. So they're trying to eat and evade predators, and to think about the limited mobility they have relative to where they nest, it just screams that we need to do better at a local landscape scale at making sure that they have those various conditions that will allow those populations to grow. And that's really where the dynamic forest program with American Bird Conservancy evolved, is really through that conservation science and thinking about, all right, we've got to do better. There are folks like Dan and other groups, private landowners as well, that have been doing this work in the forest, right? It's not like they haven't been out there doing work in the forest. Resources, when you have a shared vision, brings forest and wildlife together, and these goals and objectives together. And we think about how we can work as a partnership to focus our resources, like as in money, to do a lot of that non-commercial work that has, that's really important in order for us to be able to move on to some of the more impactful practices. That's really where the dynamic forest restoration block concept came from.
So Jeff or Dan, how big are these dynamic forest restoration blocks, or is that driven by the bird species and the habitat needs of those birds?
They range between 3 and I'd say 30,000 acres. It depends.
Oh,
we primarily work in 3 parts of Pennsylvania. And those 3 portions of Pennsylvania being the Laurel Highlands, the North Central region, and then the Poconos region. Those regions in and of themselves support important forest bird communities. Canada warbler, wood thrush, cerulean warbler, golden wing. A lot of those species that are most imperiled. So we focus on those regions of the state, and then within those regions, what makes all of this work is that we have partners, right? We have folks that manage the land that share the vision that we have. So it's not like we identify where the dynamic forest blocks are going to be. We identify that, hey, we are happy to work in this region because there are important avian conservation needs in this region, populations we need to keep on the landscape. And we let our partners identify which of the land units they particularly manage that are going to basically be adopted into the dynamic forest restoration block program.
Is it kind of dictated by like those willing partners too? Like you might really want it in a particular place, but without the partners, you go to wherever that there's a willingness to actually work?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I cannot overstate the importance of the partnership, right? And the partners Dan does not need, and Dan's foresters, nor any of the partners we work with, they don't need us telling them how to do what they need to do. They might need our input as far as like spatial arrangements and what some of the nuances of the species we're most interested in require. But no, in most cases, they have places where they have been, for whatever reason, limited in their ability to implement forest management for whatever. It could be resources, could be access. We want to work with them to eliminate the bottleneck. Whatever it is we can do within our grant funds, we're happy to work with them to overcome those challenges that they face.
How many of these do you have across Pennsylvania?
We started in 2017. This is really for your listeners. I think this is really important because I'm going to throw some bigger numbers out here, but I want to say we started small. Since 2017, we've designated more than 366,000 acres across 35 unique forest blocks. Again, they range from 3 to 30,000 acres in size. They sometimes are adjacent to each other, so we might have a private hunt club with 4,000 acres that's adjacent to a game lands, that's adjacent to a state park. So we might have collections that are kind of like connected landscapes. But we have that many. But I really think it's important to point out that in 2017, when we first applied for external funding, and we thought we could apply for about $250,000 is what the RFP said we could ask for. We wrote the grant, and the funder came back, a terrific supporter of our program, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, came back and said, yeah, I know it said 250,000, but we really only have 72,000 this year. Can you do? And we were like, no, we'll take it. We will absolutely take it. We will do something good with it. And that's where we started our first block. It wasn't even an entire game lands. It was half of a game lands in the Poconos. We took that opportunity and we did the best we could with it. And we brought more partners to the table, and we demonstrated that drafting a dynamic forest comprehensive plan, the monitoring of birds beforehand, and of course actually implementing forest management. We showed that at scale within that half of a DFRB. And from that point on, I think we're up to about $15 million since 2017 that we have been able to raise either as partner matching or from our funders.
So that's a kind of like start small and get big.
Yeah. But
then each of those areas, so each of the dynamic forest restoration blocks you mentioned has a plan. What does that plan look like? Is it very, very detailed, or is it more broad in scope?
So I can talk about how the DFRBs on game lands, how we do the planning for those. So the game lands system in Pennsylvania it's really cool in that their parcels range in size from just a few hundred acres to, I think, almost 50,000 acres. And so we're looking at, I think all of our DFRBs, at least in my area, are kind of between that 5 and 25,000 acre range. So each of those game lands all along has had a comprehensive management plan that lays out kind of what we want to do there. And I think working through the DFRB concept, for me at least, has helped really improve those plans. So kind of we use our comprehensive management plans as the DFRB plan, and really needing to dial in on what the desired future conditions are going to be from an age class distribution standpoint, where on the landscape things are going to happen, what type of management regimes we're going to use, has really, I think, improved a lot of our comprehensive management plans. And so there is a little bit of a range of detail. We, like our foresters, kind of like everybody, and I'm sure you've met the foresters, that kind of, they have everything planned out almost like to the tree for the next 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm not so much that way. I'm more of a, like, we're going to delineate this portion of the game lands that's going to be managed in a certain management regime, and within that area we're going to try to hit X number of acres during this planning period. That's kind of how the approach I like. So each game lands that's DFRB, or even the rest of our game lands, the forested areas are given a kind of a tag that we call management type. So every acre of forest on the game lands falls into one of 4 management types. So kind of the big one is mixed succession, and you can kind of shorthand that as even age management. So that's where we're gonna get our age class diversity in the mixed succession stands. So those are going to be where we're going to primarily be doing shelter woods and overstory removals, and create that kind of pipeline of young forest habitat. Then we've got late successional management type, and so that's where we're going to be doing active management toward late successional conditions. We're going to be in there doing stand improvement things, maybe looking to increase coarse woody debris or increase structural complexity, deal with invasive pests and diseases. But ultimately, those stands are going to be left to kind of mature into old forests. And then the third one is reserve, which those are places we are not doing anything. There's no intended management there. Maybe we can't get to them. Maybe they're really sensitive sites that we're just not going to work. And then the last one is fire management, which I think is maybe better described as kind of like oak woodland or savanna management type. So where we have those kind of real fire dependent ecosystems, for us it's going to be like pitch pine, scrub oak areas. So, and those are areas that can really look like a lot of different things in the end. But when you kind of create the plan and you have every stand is designated as one of those management types, then you can really start to build a picture of what that DFRB can provide you from a habitat standpoint down the road. Because in many cases, in a mountainous part of the state, it's just not, you may only have 50% of a game lands that you can even do even aged management on. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to just kind of limit how much age class diversity you're going to make using kind of conventional forestry. But maybe you have a lot of opportunities for within stand kind of structural manipulation through hand cutting or late successional work. So that's kind of what our plans look like. And the level of detail, there's a base level we want to see in all of them, and then beyond that, it's kind of up to what the foresters think is the best thing for them.
It sounds like you almost take that stand level detail and then build up to, as you said, what that block is capable of. Mm-hmm. And then really the key link that sometimes, Brad, we miss is jumping to that landscape and what's the desired future condition, as you said, Dan, you want to get to in that block. So how is that desired future condition determined in terms of your age class distribution or the different cover types? Do you just look at, what the resource is and then what the capabilities are? And how does that planning process look?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's, on many landscapes, because of topography and site limitations, steep slopes, we generally, want to maximize that age class diversity within that mixed succession area. So the goal for that mixed succession area is kind of like, well, it's to balance the age classes. And so that's kind of the standard goal in that management type. And that seems to generally work because, when you have a 10,000 acre game lands and only half of it is really in that bucket, you're really not butting up against having too much young forest probably. Because if you're going to run that half of the game lands on 100 or 120 year rotation, if it's an oak dominated game land, you're still, only going to have 10% of that area that's really in that 0 to 10 bucket at any one time. So in quite a few cases of just having that general goal of like maximizing diversity, you're going to put a lot of almost all of what you can put into mixed, you're going to probably put in mixed. But I want to be very careful in saying there are many cases where we're also, working with our biologists, our land managers, and like the planning team that writes the plan to identify places, and they might be great timber, easily operable. We could make young forest there, but for whatever reason, maybe the species composition or just the location on the landscape, we think they're really important and would be better served as late successional stands. So it's not just about operability by any stretch. We're putting stands, right along a road with, a good example might be a really nice 120-year-old saw timber sized white oak stand with maybe a hickory component or something. Boy, that's a stand that just has a ton of wildlife value as a mature forest. And so you might want to think hard about whether that should be late successional. And we can go in there and do some kind of stand health management and increase, regen in case something happens to the overstory, but not ever actually regenerate that, use an even age method. So the approach that we take a lot is we kind of take a first swipe at the plan, kind of looking at what the landscape can kind of provide us. Then we might dial in and look at are there particular wildlife species on this game lands that are really important. So for example, maybe snowshoe hare in parts of our region, or ruffed grouse are kind of important all over. Or is it a species that really benefits more from kind of big mature forest patches? Then we start to kind of tweak it one way or the other to reach that desired future condition that makes the most sense for the species that are important on that landscape and, realistically what the landscape can provide. And I mean, you'll hear numbers, particularly for things like grouse, that we want to have, 15 or 20% of a landscape in, that young forest habitat. Well, the reality is just a lot of our landscapes have a hard time providing that sustainably because, with our rotation lengths and the forest types we have and the kind of inaccessible places, it's just hard to hit those numbers. So we can do the best we can within the landscape constraints and then kind of push it one way or the other to try to meet specific goals. So each plan has, kind of what we expect those desired future conditions should be in it. And then we do like a 5-year checkup in the middle of the plan. It's a 10-year plan to kind of see if we're moving in that right direction or not.
Do you ever look outside the boundary of your area to kind of maybe sway your goals one way or the other, thinking maybe this part of the landscape is going to provide it, so maybe we don't have to provide that part?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a game lands in our region that is surrounded by a wild area that's managed by our Bureau of Forestry, where, as far as I know, they're not going to, no planned management in that area, and it's almost 50,000 acres. And so if there's going to be any young forest in there, other than, wind throw and kind of natural events, it's going to be on our game lands. The one interesting kind of twist to that is what I find is when I start looking at the landscape, you can start looking at it all different ways. You could look at it and say, well, maybe we should lean into that and have an enormous area of mature forest habitat, and maybe we actively manage ours, but push it towards late succession, or maybe we should provide the thing that's not being provided in the landscape. So that's where, talking to our biologists and working with folks like Jeff can help us kind of, make those decisions. And just another example of that is like we have a lot of smaller game lands, maybe 1,000-acre game lands it's in an agricultural landscape. Those would not be places where we're using this approach, because we're not looking for kind of maybe maximum diversity of age classes there. Maybe in that landscape, mature oak stands are so limiting that almost all of them are going to be managed as late successional forests. So yeah, we certainly look at that landscape context when trying to pick out what those future conditions should be.
Yeah, and I would add that there are some dynamic forest restoration blocks that do not have a comprehensive plan. They didn't start with a comprehensive plan. They might be from partners, large private landowners, for example, some of our other public lands outside of the Game Commission, where there's not a forest management plan. And the first step in that process is we have 4 foresters out there right today that are DFRB foresters. They are inventorying these lands. They're delineating stands. They are identifying what we would say the assets, the opportunities, the threats, and all of that goes into our GIS and in a plan development. And at the end of the day, we come out with a 15-year dynamic forest restoration block plan, and maybe the identification of a few kind of low-hanging fruit projects to get those landowners kind of moving in the direction of diversifying their forest landscapes. The other thing I just want to point out with the adjacency question that you asked, what's most important is, yeah, you could have a 5,000 acre reserve on the outside of a DFRB, but we have to keep in mind the really important driver of why we're doing dynamic forest restoration, right? It's the ecologically and biologically meaningful scales. So, you could have a 5,000 acre forest block that's mature, right? And the iconic oven bird of that mature forest, we know, in recent decades that they take their fledglings to places with dense understories, sometimes regenerating timber harvests, if available. They have to get there. So, being in a 5,000 acre block of mature forest and being some great distance to some place where they need to bring their young, that's quite a distance away. That is what could be driving a lot of these bird population declines. So we have to be cognizant of the biology that's going on here. Yeah.
So it sounds like to me that there's a lot of customization that goes into the blocks, depending on what resources you have within there and what the needs are of the species that you have within that.
Yeah, I think a great example, Dan, is DFRB 89, where the intention was that shelter wood and to regenerate that one stand. And I'll never forget Dan, one mid-May, Dan calling me from the field and sending me a video, and this stand had just had its first entry of the shelter wood, and it was just dripping with cerulean warblers, songs of cerulean. He was like, and I make fun of Danny. Don't know if he knows all his birds. I didn't think he knew cerulean warbler, but he did after that day. He's just like, I think these are cerulean warblers, and I mean, it was impressive. And then later to find out, Dan and his foresters in the north central region said, hey, that stand's not going to regenerate anymore. That's where it's staying. We're going to manage it, as cerulean warbler nesting habitat. The response was so great. So kind of the ability to pivot, to be able to say, hey, we just learned something here. We just the monitoring aspect, right? This was not officially identified through the monitoring process. It was Dan monitoring, just doing his due diligence as a manager of those lands in the midst of a timber harvest, that they came to the recognition that, hey, this place has got a great response of a species that's really not doing that well. So let's leave it as is and try to sustain the population here on this site.
Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the Silvicast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show. I'm curious, and this is maybe just a side tangent to it, but how do you guys wrap climate change and climate change considerations into this?
When I think about that, I think that climate change is really just like one more stressor that we're going to be dealing with on top of the pile of other stressors. We have a lot of spongy moth issues Pennsylvania have had for 30 years. So, our oak stands are at risk of being defoliated once every decade or so. We've had a bunch of late frosts the last couple of years that have really hammered some of our white oak stands. And so what I see when those stress events happen is that when you have a landscape of age class diversity, when the young stands can handle that stuff. So you don't want all your really nice oak stands to be 120 years old. You want some of them to be 10 years old and some of them to be 25 years old. And I think those stands seem to be much more resilient to those types of events. And something I think just kind of on the stress front that, I've really been thinking about lately is as our oak stands in particular continue to kind of accumulate these stress events over the years, are they really going to last 150 years, 200 years, like we kind of think of oak being able to do? I'm not so sure. So one of our big focuses in our game lands and on these DFRBs in stands, those late successional stands that we've designated for some reason because we like what's growing there now. It's a really nice mature oak forest that's important for, let's say, acorn production for game species or something. We better be working toward establishing regen in the understory of that stand, even if we don't have any intention of regenerating it. If we want that to be as permanent as anything can be, a long-term oak resource on the landscape. So kind of just creating that resiliency, I think, is really important for all those stressors.
Yeah, that gets to a lot of conversations we've had, Brad, with folks like Dan Day and
Joe Herring,
Pat Rose, and all about oak stands and creating those advanced regeneration conditions.
Yeah.
And even, you remember Joe Herring in Iowa talking about, just like you were saying, Dan, the immediate problems with these stands aren't holding together as long as they thought they were going to. What about the original or the stressor? When I think of Pennsylvania, we always think of one stressor and that would be deer.
Yeah.
So what about deer? How do you incorporate deer into these?
Well, they are incorporated, but that's for sure. That deer are a constant thing that we have to consider. Deer impact is variable across all the different game lands, as I'm sure you guys know. It's localized, much worse, but in some areas not as bad in other areas. But in general, they all have some level of deer impact that is a big challenge for us, and so some of the resources that we are allocating towards these game lands are for things like deer fences. We actually use quite a lot of deer fencing on all these blocks in the regeneration process. And I mean, nobody likes deer fences. They're expensive. They're hard to maintain. But we do have certain landscapes where we just aren't able to move forward without some kind of deer protection. And I think, as a deer hunter, and Jeff deer hunts with me on some of these DFRBs, the thing is we're improving deer habitat all along by creating young forest and by making browse. We're just making better conditions for deer, so we're kind of pulling them into these places. I've not really seen, at least on our landscapes, the ability to kind of hit that landscape level of browse that we can kind of overwhelm them. Just haven't seen it in the north central region. It maybe is just because there's so many kind of deep, dark canyons that they can hide in deer season and then come out and forage on our sales and project areas and prescribed fire areas. So it's a constant challenge for us, and we're kind of always thinking ahead about sale layout, sales shape, that like if we have to put a fence around something, we need to be able to do that. And of course, it also, deer impact also sometimes means that you have to be more aggressive at treating interfering vegetation that you might not have had to. The desirable seedlings weren't, being hindered in their height growth. So if we played a drinking game, talking about deer, I'd be in big trouble because I talk about it all the time.
Is that ever an objective within a block? You mentioned, Dan, of getting to a certain percentage in young forests. Simply, I kind of think of just a conversation we had with Susan Stout about the Kinzua unit, which is in Pennsylvania as well, and that idea of getting to a certain threshold on the landscape of young forests where deer browse is lessened because they have more forage. Is that ever a goal within the blocks, or you said you haven't seen that?
It's not a goal for a couple reasons. I think it could work in certain landscapes with certain deer densities, but I think we may have in some places kind of tipped over into where that's going to be challenging, in some of our landscapes. And the other thing about it is you kind of end up subsuming all your other goals for interspersion and landscape diversity if you're trying to hit that big number. Now, we actually have done that in places where we've had a lot of spongy moth mortality and have salvaged 3, 4, 5,000 acres in just a few years. And no doubt in those areas, this was maybe 10 to 12 years ago, we did see a pretty good regen response. The problem was once all of that hit stem exclusion, there was nothing to eat on that landscape.
Yeah, that's the problem, right?
That's the problem. Like, it's one of my colleagues that I work with here, she has said, well, it's a lever you can pull exactly one time on a landscape. And I think that's exactly right. And so, like, on that landscape that had all that young forest heading towards stem exclusion, some of those stands, we weren't super thrilled with the kind of the regen species mix in there, and so we were going to start, and we also wanted to kind of try to break up that like giant age class slug so we could keep some of that young forest going a little bit longer. So we started in on burning some of those stands, and I'm not talking, we were burning 20 acres. I mean, we were doing, maybe 200-acre burns in these, 8-year-old clear cuts to try to improve the competitive situation of the oak, and also to kind of set some of them back. And the problem is, at that point, because most of the landscape was heading into stem exclusion, when we burned that 200-acre stand, it just got kind of annihilated in a landscape that just 5 years before that we were seeing really positive results, because that was the only 200 acres right there that
pulled the deer into that resprout. Yeah,
it seemed to. So it's a big challenge.
I got a whole bunch of questions. Just trying to think about implementing this here. We've been looking for different ways to try to do a better job at the landscape level. And Jeff, you had mentioned monitoring and how maybe you use the songbirds to maybe monitor what the results are. What does that look like? Do you do like pre-monitoring before you start a block, or when you first start a block and then afterwards?
Yeah, we sure do. So we kind of think about collecting baseline data and then kind of longitudinal down the line, and probably down the line long after, Dan and I are on the job, and thinking about, you have to consider just how long it's going to take for us to respond, right? We implement a treatment, a practice, and then Mother Nature needs to do her thing, and hopefully deer allow that to happen, and recognize that deer might be a part of that structural complexity as well. So yeah, forest birds, right? They have this intimate relationship. We have such diversity of forest birds because they have this intimate relationship between forest structure and species composition. And what are the things that we're manipulating when we're managing landscapes is structure and composition. When a DFRB comes online, we monitor it for the first 2 years. So what we first do is we randomly assign, well, it's kind of like a systematic random, stratified random, because we are trying to sample. If there is some diversification already in this block, then we want to make sure we have some points in those places as well. But think about a couple of hundred points at least in a dynamic forest block scattered all over the place. And during the breeding season, avian breeding season, we have point count technicians that visit each of those points twice. They visit them for 10 minutes each, assessing bird communities. We then go back at the end of the season and we do a vegetation assessment at that point count location. In 2020, we started using autonomous recording units. We teamed up with Justin Kitz's lab at the University of Pittsburgh, a terrific bioacoustics lab. It's really, we started realizing, when you start out, you're like, 200 points to do this year, 400 points to do this year. We're up to almost 4,000 points that we have in our monitoring program. Now, we don't obviously monitor all 4,000 in a year, but you start to run into constraints, right? Where you have to have people who can know their birds, know their forest birds well, so you get rigorous information, and are comfortable working in pretty remote, rugged places. Encounters with bears and rattlesnakes and ticks and all that comes with that, and steep terrain, and being able to navigate, you start to come to a little bit of a limitation. But what's beautiful about the autonomous recording units is we put them out. We can program them. We put them out there now. Actually, we have a crew out there putting autonomous recording units out. We can capture the rough grouse drumming period. We can program them in the evening for woodcock. We can program them at night in May and June and July for whippoorwill. We can get the morning songbird all on one set of batteries that we put a unit out. We visit it, right? We put it out today and we don't collect it until June or end of July. So we have this terrific amount of baseline information on both the bird community as well as the forest structure on those points. And we should also think about those recordings. They're recording everything, right? So katydids, whatever, coyotes, whatever makes some kind of an acoustical cue, we're actually having a baseline signature for baseline data that we can then go back and compare 10 years down the road when we go back and reassess these places using the same methodologies. Cam Fiss, Dr. Fiss recently finished his PhD from SUNY ESF. He is the student that he was actually originally a master's student of mine on Golden Wing and wanted to go on for his PhD. So he studied under Jonathan Cohen at ESF, and his PhD analyzed many thousands of those locations, the data from those locations, and combined it with LiDAR. And he subdivided those landscapes into sub-landscapes, 600 hectares in size, thinking about the size of a typical forest compartment, if you will, a collection of stands. And then his analysis using those LiDAR data, he looked at the avian conservation value of a landscape relative to forest diversification, structural diversification. And lo and behold, the hypothesis was supported, right? As landscapes became more diverse in their canopy height diversity, from a canopy height diversity perspective, the more important those landscapes came to conserving forest birds as a community. When you rank all of those birds and give them a conservation score, and then take that into account when you're looking at the response of the forest bird community to the dynamic forest management that's occurring. We look forward. We're gearing up for a big push here in a couple of years. We're going to hit the 10-year mark. We should start to see even more response of our forest management from a bird perspective, and look forward to be able to report back on that.
It's interesting, Greg. I think I learned about this talking to John Steigerwalt and reading about it in the Rough Grouse magazine. And I've been impressed that they've been a real big proponent of it, not only the young forest, but, like the forest as a whole. And I think that this says a lot about the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys are what, like in IT terms, you're the early adopters?
I think so.
And now the rest of us are kind of like maybe coming to play or coming to the table and saying, this is really cool. So what do you see as the future of this tool? Do you see a lot of other places kind of getting interested in it, or maybe even expansion again within Pennsylvania?
I think that our program is serving as a terrific model.
Yeah.
To date, we've been invited to share our process, share our successes and our lessons learned with agencies and conservation groups from, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, probably missing a few there. Just, whether they be agency folks interested or conservation groups like RGS. And sometimes very much collection of partners are interested in hearing about our approach. I love the fact that there is interest, and you can think about how that might bring competition for scarce resources for a group to be able to do the work that we do. But at the end of the day, this is, conservation through cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
And if everyone can, we believe strongly and passionately about the approach we're using, the dynamic forest restoration block approach. And because of that, if we can have more entities adopt this approach, test the approach, monitor it, I think it's important that if you're going to adopt it, you adopt it in its completeness, right? This is about young forest, middle-aged forest, old forest, all distributed on the landscape, interspersed on the landscape, and in significant proportions, right? They are all represented. That's not what we see on much of our forested landscapes today. Our contemporary forest landscapes are quite skewed to middle-aged forest. We need that interspersion of young, we need that interspersion of old, and we need to find a way, as Dan pointed out earlier, how the heck we're going to keep, this isn't a one shot and done, right? We need to figure out how you're going to keep it, perpetuate that kind of a ratio and interspersion on the landscape. That's going to take an immense number of partners to be able to continue to do this work. We weren't able to raise $7 million from NIFWIF and other foundations over the last 7-8 years by just us. We had folks contribute to the matching requirements, right? Because they believed in the program, because they believe in the shared vision that we have. So yeah, I'm delighted when I hear you say that you're at a meeting and you hear rough grouse members and staff speaking highly of the dynamic forest restoration block program.
So one last piece of advice: if we're out there thinking about starting this particular system on the landscape, do you have a piece of advice for us starting out?
I'll say if you're a manager and I'm sure every land manager or forester is in this boat where you have a list of projects you would love to do, but you just have not been able to get the resources, to get the money, to deal with the vegetation issues or whatever it is. This is a way to kind of focus efforts. And this is not a way to force on you some goals that you probably don't already have. Odds are you're going to be able to fit this approach really into your planning process already. And as Jeff said, it's a way to kind of deal with those bottlenecks. And so I think, foresters are, kind of a curmudgeon-y group sometimes and don't want people telling them what to do. That's not what this is. This is a way to facilitate work that you probably have kind of sitting somewhere that you would just love to do and haven't been able to do. So be open to it, to partnering with whoever you need to kind of get this done and kind of really achieve the goals that you may have had for many years.
Yeah, it's kind of a structure to follow.
Yeah.
To help guide what you're already doing, as you said, Dan.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I also think it's important to recognize, as I mentioned earlier, like it's okay to start small. And before you know it, like I can't believe it's 2025, right? I just can't believe that in, 2017, when we first wrote that proposal and we were awarded funding, if you would have said, hey, in 2025, you'll have 366,000 acres, 35 blocks, you'll have private land blocks with TNC and Buck Hills Conservation Foundation and other groups, and you'll have partners like state parks and the Game Commission. Like, never would have dreamt that. Certainly, we knew that we weren't going to stop it. We weren't just going to stop there. We had some kind of a goal, but we didn't really think that we were going to grow this big. But it's important to keep in mind that you start somewhere and you take advantage of the opportunities. And then I guess my last piece would be that if you're starting out and you're interested in this, we welcome anyone to contact us. We don't have all the answers. That's one thing we haven't really mentioned here, Dan, and that is that Dan and I use the word humility quite a bit. You have to approach this with a certain amount of humility because, well, in the history of managing forested landscapes, no one's really tried to do it at this scale before. And there are a lot of challenges on the landscape that we've talked about here today. So, approach it with humility. If you want to talk to us, if you want to come out to Pennsylvania and see a DFRB, we welcome folks. We do tours every year, whether they're private landowners or public agency staff and everything in between, academic groups. We're happy to share. And we have a lot of lessons learned and things we do differently just as much as we have successes. So, yeah, that's what our recommendation would be.
Well, there you go. Open door invitation.
There you go.
Be careful. We'll be on your doorstep tomorrow.
Be careful what you say.
We'll do it.
Jeff and Dan, thanks a lot for this conversation. And
yep,
I think this is something we'll be looking at more here in our state as we try to figure out different ways to manage on a broader scale, at scale. And so this gives us a lot to chew on. So I really appreciate your time and talking about it today.
Yeah, great conversation, guys.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Brad, for a lot of reasons, we've not been that great at managing at the landscape level. So I really like this idea of breaking up that landscape into more manageable chunks, like we talked about. It's kind of a simple concept, but I think developing targets at that level would be much more efficient.
I think you nailed it with saying that we're not. I think you're actually being polite and saying we haven't been good. I don't think we've even tried, really. I mean, we talk about, we okay, yeah, I won't go to a dark place, but I think this is a real opportunity, something we should really be talking more about. And hopefully everyone will get just as excited and say, hey, how would I do something like this? I could see something like this being related to like deer management assistance program, or maybe integrating something. I love that idea of like the Kinsua, where you have maybe multiple landowners getting together and kind of informing their management with knowledge about what's happening in the landscape around them.
Yeah.
That'd be very cool. Very, very cool.
So, Brad, also today, I have an announcement to make.
Let me guess. You're going to plug the 2025 Northern Hardwood Conference this August 5th through 7th in Syracuse, New York.
Well, yeah, you just stole my thunder, but that's what I was going to do.
Well,
it is the third biennial Northern Hardwood Conference. So I'm really pleased that whole series is continuing to move on, and we're continuing to bring together folks working with this particular type.
Yeah.
So if you're available, registration, I believe, is still open.
Cool. Greg, I was going to ask you a question about it too. So are there going to be tours associated with it? Do you know much about the agenda yet?
I believe, and don't quote me anyone on this, but I believe the first day is kind of in-house presentations, breakout sessions. I believe the second day is all tours, multiple sites.
Okay.
And then it wraps up with some more breakout sessions, presentations for like not a full day on the last day.
Okay, cool.
So I think that's the general agenda, but it's early right now. They do have a website up. I think I just today Googled 2025 Northern Hardwood Conference. The website came up, and you can get whatever the latest and greatest information is.
Cool. And Silvicast will have the 24-hour hospitality room associated with it?
Well, I'm not going, but you are going, and so you will have to hold down the hospitality room. Yeah.
Oh, boy. There will be stories, Greg.
Mm-hmm.
There will be stories. Well, thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode of Silvicast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, just let us know. Actually, contact us anytime you want. You can call us 24/7, 365. Greg?
Yeah. Brad's personal cell number is...
Call at 2 in the morning. You can reach us anytime. But a better way to reach us would be to email UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question, and we'll put you on the air so you'll hear yourself as a part of a Silvicast episode, which I think would be really cool. But you just send an email, whatever you want to send. I think anything would be great. And always remember, we learn best when we wrestle with questions, so please keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music, still by Paul Frater, and, of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.